Okay, hi DealTheNuts, this is Phaedrus. This is a heads-up fixed limit session review against a particularly tough heads-up player. It's the sort of player that I'd normally quit on fairly early on. However, primarily for my own game development, I decided to keep playing this guy, and I set myself a stop loss of 50 big bets. And at this point of the session, I'm pretty close to the win on hitting that, which is why I'm writing a $20 stack, because I wasn't reloading after having lost that. So I'm about $80 down in just 38 hands. The previous 38 hands, I was playing my normal default reasonably. I think you'd characterise my standard game as fairly tight aggressive for fixed limit, so I'd normally be playing something like a 75-60 VPIP pre-flop raise kind of stat against a solid aggressive player. My 3-bet would be in the range of 20 to 25%. These stats for me are limited to just this session, and from this point on, or fairly shortly, I make a fairly significant style adjustment to counteract my opponent's very, very aggressive game. So I'll just go through the stats quickly of my HUD layout. The top line is pre-flop raise, is VPIP pre-flop raise, and then aggression factor. And villain's aggression factor at 4 is kind of off the charts for heads up. 50% went to showdown is also incredibly high, and 49% won at showdown. 44% won at showdown. Second line is pre-flop 3-bet, and then aggression frequency by street, flop, turn and river. Flop C-bet, fold to flop C-bet, turn C-bet, fold to turn C-bet, river C-bet, fold to river C-bet. Fourth line is pre-flop raise from the button or steal, and then fold to steal, and then donk bet percentage, number of hands, and villain's name. So up until this point, I've been struggling to find the right counter adjustment to villain's very aggressive game. I've been primarily fighting aggression with aggression, and as is the case in heads up, you often don't have much of a hand, and villain has consistently been outflopping me and showing up with a better hand in these very large pots that I've created by trying to fight his aggression with aggression back at him. So that strategy hasn't been working at all well. It's taken me a lot of money and 38 hands to properly adjust, and I think that's way too long. I should have made better adjustments much sooner on in the match, but fairly shortly we'll see particularly some, both pre-flop and post-flop adjustments to better respond to his aggressive game than I had been incorporating earlier in the match. The 43% 3-bet percentage was one of the reasons why I wanted to keep on playing against this player and his very high barreling tendencies. You can see 93, 81 bet the turn at 65% barrel through to the river. I thought that there were leaks in and ways to exploit those tendencies, but up until this point I hadn't properly adjusted to an exploitative counter strategy to that. So this session is primarily about that counter strategy. Against the very high 3-betting percentage, there's two default adjustments. One is to start 4-betting whenever you have an equity edge over his pre-flop 3-bet range. That is typically my default response, but most 1-2 players are not particularly great post-flop. This guy was very strong post flop, and as a result I decided to start with the second counter adjustment strategy, which is to start pre-flop limping. Ordinarily it's a strategy I pretty well never do. However, when you've got a player that is 3-betting a lot and playing well post flop, you want to be minimising the size of the flop pot so that you can release a little bit quicker, particularly when someone's got very high barreling tendencies. The worst line you can take is check call, check call, check fold, and so once you've gotten past the flop, you want to be getting to the river quite often against a player like this, and by open raising and then having to call a 3-bet, you make those flop folds more costly. So I do like the open limping strategy in response to his very aggressive game against this opponent. I think this should be a fairly standard check raise. And then when I get 3-bet, a raise gets 3-bet, I think the appropriate strategy here is I'll see you at showdown. There's not really any turn or river combinations that I'll fold unless it is perhaps a 4 flush. What I do like about that hand was going into the call down mode after the flop 3-bet. Earlier on in the match, I've been capping in spots like that and going 2 nuts on the river. Which is pretty bad. Still not quite at the open limping stage yet, though 39 hands into the match, and I've been getting 3-bet an absolute ton. I think Jack Queen is a pretty good cap against his range there, and I don't like that flat call of a 3-bet. You've got to do something. If I'm continuing to open raise, then I should have been capping pre-flop there, and I don't mind that call down. I've got Queen high with the nut kicker, so against his range, the only thing I'm really losing to is ace high and pairs. I'll just go back pre-flop there. So now we've started the open limping. And I've got to say, it does seem to throw him into a bit of a spin, and for a good while he doesn't raise my limps nearly as frequently as he raises my pre-flop opens. I think that's a fairly reasonable call down on his part, and reasonably well played with a pair and a gut shot. At this stage, and I think I should have maintained it, though I don't. Still three betting reasonably wide, skewed towards value three betting. Later on in the match, I try to tie in my out of position pre-flop strategy into the in position strategy, which I think is a bit of an unnecessary additional adjustment. And I don't like that check behind on the turn. Just keep betting. I think I'm trying to give him some room to bluff, given that there's not much he can have on that board, but I think he can probably bluff into my continuation bet anyway. And all I do really there on the river is it makes it look like I've got a strong hand, I think. Checking with a view to getting the showdown here is, I think, pretty reasonable with my king high. I do like the flop fold there. The board's reasonably wet in order to realise any equity from my king high. I'm mostly going to have to take it to showdown. In order to do that, I've got to run the parlay of him not having any made hand yet, and there's potentially so many bad cards that can come on the turn and river combination that I think just releasing it early is good, particularly against this player who's going to keep betting regardless. Important that if you do incorporate that pre-flop limping strategy, that you're faithful to it, including limping aces. And I don't particularly like that flop raise. I think you can delay that to the turn. Given what we know about this player, who's going to be betting the turn 100% pretty much. This is a pretty good hand to take a check call line with. I've got outs, and he can quite easily put me on a flush draw without a pair. When he checks the flop, that's from this player mostly going to be a hand that's given up because the board's just missed him so much and he doesn't see enough fold equity. I think betting the turn is fine. The raise here certainly can't be folded, but from his point of view, my bet can look fairly weak, given he checked, and there are so many potential draws. Any queen, plus obviously any spade. I think I remember this hand. I'll just make sure it is the same hand. And I do like the call on the river, particularly when it bricks off. Yeah. So that was his strategy in that hand, that after he checks the turn, he assumes that checks the flop, I'll be stabbing pretty light at the turn. I can have a range that includes nothing, but also includes a lot of draws. So he's raising the turn, intending to bet all brick rivers, assuming that I'll fold my missed draws, all the nothing part of my range. And I think that's probably a pretty good way to play his hand. And I do like that check back there. So here I do delay the flop raise to the turn, and despite the other overcard coming, I think it's a good card for the overall situation. There's a lot of worse hands that he can call me with, assuming that I'm on some sort of a draw. The queen gives a draw to so many straight draws, and it also introduces the double flush draw. So certainly a lot of hands he can call me on that are worse than second pair. And I think this should just be a call down. Again, earlier on in the match, I would have been raising and building an unfeasibly large pot for second pair no kicker. And just go back to that hand. I think an important important strategy adjustment, counter strategy to this guy's very high aggression levels is not tell him that he's beat too early on in the hand. He's got a very high tendency to keep barreling, maximising his fold equity. But in doing that, he's a good enough player to know when he's beaten, get out of the way of raises without a pretty strong hand. So if I'm telling him that he's beat too early, then that plays into his strategy of maximising fold equity and then only continuing on with big hands when he's got the goods. So I want him to waste money, so to speak, or lose more when he's barreling with air by not giving him information to suggest that he doesn't have fold equity. It kind of skews your own game to a call stationy kind of game, a loose, weak, passive game, which is obviously probably the worst way you can play poker as a default. However, it's not quite as an outrageous a strategy as your classic call station, but you do need, in my opinion, to be doing a lot more calling and a lot less raising against a player like this, just because of that information hiding value. A good loose aggressive player is working on a strategy of pushing you off air and pushing you off weak made hands, and he'll be doing that with all of his range. The minute you tell him that he can't be pushed, he'll slow down, if not fold, and I think that's just giving him too much information that's playing into a good solid lag strategy. And I think this should be a call down. On the ace-4-9 flop, there's really no turn or river cards that I can see that would justify folding. You could maybe say a 2 or a 3 or a 5, but I think that's just I think that's going to be folding too much when you've got a hand as strong as king high on this board. Certainly a 4 flush I would probably fold by the river. Now that I think is a pretty good spot for the turn check raise. Sorry, the turn raise. Very strong flop with the gut shot wheel draw and the flush draw, and also with the ace on board. That's how I would play a flopped ace to raise the turn. So yeah, I'm happy to see that I've raised that. So make the nuts on the river, but we get a fold, and I think that's showing the strength of that line against this particular player. That he's going to be able to put me on an ace there reasonably often. He's still showing down a ton, and I don't want to be doing that without some sort of a backup plan through a semi-bluff. He's a good enough hand reader that if I'm overplaying that line with air, then I'm going to get looked up too often. Yeah, and here I don't 3-bet, and I think that's a pretty big mistake. And I think that's a pretty good river value bet when he checks the turn. There's a lot of worse hands he can call with, and specifically put me on some busted club draws or just air that's floating. So yeah, I think he makes a pretty standard call with king high there. And again, I do like that line of delaying it to the turn. That's a pretty bad river because a lot of his flop range and then turn bet call range does have a 6 in it. And then also Jack 4. Yeah, I'm just trying to work out whether I should have made a river value bet there, but on a 4 straight board, I think there's plenty of combinations of hand that have a 6. So I'm not getting I'm not getting a worse hand to call more than 50% of the time there, so I think that's a pretty good check behind. And I think from memory at this point of the match, he starts readjusting to my limping strategy by now raising pre-flop a lot. I think that's a reasonable call down, and also pretty good consistent value betting from my opponent. The question is here whether to raise this turn. It probably would have been a reasonable spot to flop raise, but my counter adjustment strategy is to put a whole bunch of hands in my flop calling basket. The merit of raising the turn is that there's now quite a lot of straight and flush draws, or the club flush draw that he can put me on and call me with worse. The downside is that obviously there's another overcard, but I still think that is probably the best players to raise, and that's a pretty brutally ugly river card. This is one of the things that makes an opponent like this fairly tough to play. We know he's capable of very thin value in this spot. He's not going to slow down with a hand like pocket eights or pocket nines, even though there's now a flush, a four straight, and an overcard to any of his pairs. So I think he's going to be value betting very, very thinly here, which means that his range is not at all polarised. Had this been someone who wasn't capable of such thin value bets, then he's got a very polarised range on this board, which makes it a fairly easy call. Against this player, there's too much thin value that's beating a pair of fours. I think this is probably an okay spot to fold. And I think this should just be another I'll see you at showdown kind of hand. Not at all thrilled with that raise. My hand's way too strong to turn into a bluff. Where I was coming from is, again, part of that information hiding that I was going to delay a lot of raises to the river. However, I think on that particular river that brings in the flush is an ace scare card, and there's also obviously the king-queen, the queen-10 straight draw that's got there. So it's an ultimate scare card. But I think my hand is too strong to turn into a bluff, so I don't like that river raise at all, despite having the plan from the flop that I wanted to delay any raises, and my hand I probably do have enough of a hand to raise somewhere. I think that plan could have changed on that particular river card to just a call. I don't think I'm ever getting him to fold a king, in other words. Now with the bottom end of a four straight board, I think that's a pretty clear value bet. Interesting there that he did slow down with top pair on that particular board. The difference between that board and the previous one where he continued to bet the king 8 is that this is a much higher straightening board, and therefore much more likely to hit my range than the low board previously. So I think that's quite a reasonable check on his part on this board. I think this is another we'll see you at showdown kind of hand. That 9 is a particularly bad card, that if he was semi-bluffing, the 9 hits a lot of his range. Had it been the 9 of hearts, I think you can find or a non-club, I think you can find a case to fold. But we bing the nuts on the river. And it's interesting that he does have a bet fold line there on the 4 flush board. And yeah, mixing things up with a flop raise I think is fine there. I've been doing a lot of calling recently. And bing the river again. Yeah, interesting, he was going for the turn check raise when he's picked up top pair. And pretty expert check behind. I think the default here again should be I'll see you at showdown. And the turn, yeah, the turn praise is probably actually better, given that it provides some additional protection for the strength of a hand, and the paired 6 kind of freezes things that he's not going to be able to raise, bluff raise all that easily now. And when I'm called on that flop, I think there's not much point in barreling the turn. And this should be a check behind. Of King Eye's reasonably strong against all of his busted draw range, and there's no better hand than I'm going to get to fold. So at this point in the match, my style adjustment seems to have worked very well. Put on just under $70 in probably about 30 hands or so, 35 hands. And the effectiveness of that is purely an exploitative strategy, where you're identifying an error that your opponent makes, which in this case is this very high barreling frequency. So the counter adjustment strategy is to let him keep making that error, and as I said before, avoiding giving away information too early in the hand that tells him he's beat, so that he can continue to make that barreling error. This should be a fairly easy peel, with some backdoor draws and 2 overcards to second pair. I think giving up now's reasonable. I don't have odds to draw to the pair at 3 to 1. Had odds on the flop, not on the turn. And calling down with queen high is probably a little bit ambitious. I actually don't mind that line. Given my strategy of delaying a lot of action to the turn and river, I can't afford to be showing down with strong hands at the turn and river all of the time. The thing I like about the raise is recognising that my queen high doesn't have enough showdown value to call. The thing I don't like about my raise is I think ace high and king high calls every time. But being caught out there, I think has some metagame advantages. Yeah, I don't think that's a disaster. I think calling would have been pretty bad, and the river raise makes some sense out of the turn call, which otherwise I think should have been a fold. And I like that release very early on in the hand. Now, after I've just been caught bluffing, even though I've got king high, there's quite a lot of bad turn and river cards that can come if I'm not behind already. I've only got outs to, if he doesn't have an ace, I've only got outs to the king, and my image after the last hand is going to be a little bit suspect, so I don't want to be trying to run any bluffs at the moment. So with a combination of not that great showdown equity and after the last hand probably pretty poor fold equity, I think releasing early is the correct play. I think calling down his reasonably fine. That's a disaster of a river card. And not betting the flop is probably okay for balance. The thing about that board texture is there's a lot of hands that he can semi-bluff. I do want to be keeping the pot small. That rivers, as I said, is a pretty disastrous card, but we also know that he's going to bet it 100% of the time with 100% of his range. We don't have a huge amount of stats on bet versus miss c-bet because I haven't been open raising very much. But certainly you would assume on that flop, he can, after I've checked it, he can be betting a very wide range. The problem is there's quite a lot of that wide range. Includes a semi-bluff, most of which got there on the river. Again, I surprised myself. That's probably a pretty interesting play. What I like about it is it forces villain to have a 3 or a flush or an ace. I also like that it's recognising that king high has lost a lot of its showdown value. The only thing I don't like about it, well, you might be able to level myself into agreeing with this now, that what I don't like is that it's just so soon after I was caught bluffing before. But applying the leveling game, you might well say that he's going to think that I won't be bluffing again because I was just caught bluffing. But no, he does have the goods. And again, this now should most definitely be a fold. Even with 2 overs, I don't have the odds to be drawing. Against a lot of opponents, not a bad, and in a lot of some other situations, not a bad flop peel, because I have got some backdoor straight. I can represent some flushes, and I've got some overcards to second pair, 2 overcards to bottom pair. But I don't think I've got much fold equity against this opponent at this particular point in time. So without being able to turn my hand into a bluff at any point, it would have been better to fold the flop, I think. I think I've just listened to my own advice on that hand, which, given that dynamic, probably makes the king 2 flop call pretty questionable, because it's just not going to flop a hand often enough. And I do decide to wait to the river this time because I think that's good and probably important, because the last 2 times I've got aggressive on the river, I've had air, and I have been raising strong hands on the turn a lot, so that's leaving my river range exposed. So I do like delaying this to the river, even though it's a pretty scary board. Just look at that river action. Yeah, I was going for the river check raise, he didn't bite. But that improves my metagame image, that he knows I can be check calling with 2 pair through to the river. That's only going to make his river play more difficult, that he knows I can be raising with bluffs, or I can show up at the river with 2 pair. Queen's a bad card, which should put me into call down mode, I think. And again, the ace is pretty bad. Yeah, I do like that value bet, but the problem is there's not that much value. You're asking him to call with king high, or a pair of 2s. What's important about it, though, is keeping him confused as to what I'm doing on the river, given that I'm employing the strategy of delaying any aggression to later in the hand. So just as I've now shown up with bluffs and strong hands at the river, I think being able to balance my river range with some thin value is important. The question is whether this is too thin value. If it is, though, any negative EV aspect of that being too thin value might well be offset by it improving, giving my river betting when check 2 range a little bit more robustness, that it's going to be less polarised. Well, that's obviously the other hand as well. We've said we're asking him to call with a pair with king high or a pair of 2s, but he can also call with the 8 with a worse kicker. So that turned out pretty well, and I think, as I said, it does help my my river perceived range, and makes it more difficult for him to play the river against me. Not a bad spot for a turn raise here. Taking the free card's not a bad option, given that what we've seen this guy capable of doing after he's checked behind on the flop, specifically that 5-8 hand where there was the 3 flush and the 4 straight board. He raised me with no hand, no draw, intending to take it off me on the river, on a bricked river. I held second pair with a flush draw. So given that previous hand, the risk of having to pay extra for my draw, and combined with having some amount of showdown value with queen high, I think the check behind is fine. Just go back and look at that hand. um, yeah, I don't have any problem with that turn bet after the double check. I'm either going to get raised or folded, and fairly good possibility I've got the best hand with king high, and getting him to fold 6 outs is a good outcome. And I think this can be not a bad hand to put into the basket of check call, check call, check fold. Certainly we know he's barreling the river. The barreling the turn a ton, but not quite as often on the river. So while you want to minimise against this player check call, check call, check fold lines, this isn't a bad hand to have in that basket. Yay. Okay, I'm happy with that. I like not raising this flop. This guy's a fairly reasonable hand reader, and also has shown himself to be pretty suspicious of semi-bluffing. So I don't think I've got that much fold equity. The turn's a pretty good card in that I've now got some showdown value. The question is whether that's given me enough equity to now raise. However, I think the very wet nature of the board, which has just got wetter, and this guy's tendencies not to give much credit to semi-bluffing on wet boards, means that I'm not going to get all that many folds. So the problem is, though, that a lot of the hands that I wasn't going to get folded on the flop were ace and king high, and I've now pulled ahead of those. So it could well be the case that we've picked up enough thin value against that range. So I think you could play this either way, but the balance then can shift towards further delaying the action, given his barreling errors. I think we've now got enough of a hand to be able to get to showdown on this very wet board, for the same reason that he's not going to give us much credit for a raise. I'm not going to give him a huge amount of credit on a bricked river, given how many semi-bluffs he could have been barreling. So I think that ties in better with the overall strategy to check call rather than, or to call rather than raise. But I've gone for the raise, which I don't think it's the end of the world. I think it's fine, and I like the check behind. So yeah, that turned out to be pretty good. We got the extra bet in against a draw. Certainly that wasn't folding on the flop. Probably would have raised, making the whole hand very difficult for the turn and the river. Yeah, fairly difficult decision on the turn, and I don't mind the raise. And we have been showing up, delaying action to the river for a long time, not doing all that much on the turn. So, yeah. Happy to see a 3-bet there. After he calls that flop, you never really know whether that's a pocket pair that's not folding an ace or just a naked float. Given the way this guy plays, it could be all of that. I think the turn's a good card in that I'm still going to be betting all aces, but it now gives me a backup plan with the flush draw. So I suspect, given his flop range, which can include a lot of naked floats, I'll get a fold out of all of those. I don't think a pocket pair's ever folding. And now we've switched back to an open raising style. So action on this hand is pretty important to whether I've got a case for semi-bluffing. That I think is fine, given that I've raised pre-flop for the first time in ages. It was 3-bet, but no point raising the turn for reasons we've previously said. This guy's not giving any respect to raises on wet boards, so just call for outs. And I can't see much point raising, even though we've hit the oh no, we haven't. We've missed everything, so it should be a fold. Yeah. Not a bad spot for a raise here. Yeah. Absolutely at the bottom of my range with a gut shot and backdoor flush draw. So a reasonable amount of equity if called, and now consistent with the style adjustment again. We've been very passive on the flop for a long time, but have switched gears, and that would be a more consistent style for a more aggressive game. Sorry, a more consistent way to play the hand in a more aggressive style. And again, given the suspicious nature of this guy, he won't be folding king or queen high here ever, I don't think, nor any pocket pair, and he'll call 100% now. Not what I'd call a great place to raise, because he's going to put me on too many draws, and can't really call that. I can't bluff that, but I can show down the best hand. A good spot to get aggressive if he shows me any action. Taking the free card I'm not really much of a fan of when I've got 9 high. If I had a stronger draw, I think that might be okay because I've got some showdown value, but here I've just got no showdown value, so I think I want to be keeping on betting to maximise fold equity. And hopefully I bet here. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable bluff. There's a lot in his range that's around the 5 and 6 and diamonds, etc. I have absolutely no showdown value. Admittedly, he hasn't raised at any point. If he had, if he did have a straight or a flush draw, I would expect him to raise. So his check call on the flop indicates probably a big card with a 5 or a 6 that has some showdown value and outs, or it's a pair. And we only are getting to fold the big cards with the 5 or the 6, but a lot of those have picked up pairs on the turn and river. So in hindsight, I think you might say that's a bit ambitious. And it might have just been better to give up, recognising that he won't have too many draws because he didn't raise, and he's not therefore folding because all the obvious draws bricked off. I think we can just fold there. Not a bad board to raise on, but the whole game dynamic has shifted again. Early on in the match, I think that board misses his 43% range often enough that you can raise, but he's also shown that he's not folding to any flop raises, which is going to increase the cost of the bluff to then continue on the turn. But at this stage of the match, we haven't got that same dynamic where he's 3-betting every hand. So I'm prepared to give him a little bit more credit. Obviously on that hand, c-betting's pretty important on the flop because we've just got absolutely nothing. And we don't want to delay it to the turn where it becomes more expensive relative to the pot size. Yes, he's not folding all that much, but on the 4-1 you're getting on a c-bet. And that's worth it with 6 high. Yeah, I think if you're going to peel the flop on this board, there's a combination of you might have the best hand plus some outs. I don't think the turn changes all that much. The obvious problem is that we're going to face a riverbed pretty often, and our kicker's very bad. As it turns out, the 7 did change things. And not really in favour of that cap. I think you want to be capping with an equity edge. Here we don't have that. Picking up a gut shot with an overcard. Given the flop cap, I do like the pre-flop cap. I do like the fast, aggressive play on the flop, and finally managed to get him to fold the hand through aggression. That should be a cap, yes. Much more happy with that than with the 10-7. And I think checking behind's good. And I do like that turn bet. I think we can get him to fold a lot of 6-outs. And given the pre-flop cap, and the fact that I didn't try to overrepresent my hand on the flop, I think I'm going to get a lot of credit for having an ace, which could potentially fold out some pocket pairs. And I like that call down. Checking behind's fine. Not a bad hand to check raise. I would have preferred a raise. I think given the style we're now playing, and I should value bet here, and that should be a call. Here's a pretty obvious call down spot. Yeah, I'm happy with how I played that hand. And that looks like it's the last hand of the session. Okay, well, I'll just quickly pull up the results graph of the session. And I think at least on this occasion that shows the effectiveness of the style change, where this massive downswing is the start of the session, where I was playing more or less my normal game, but probably ramping up the aggression in response to his very high levels of aggression, and doing so in the wrong spots. The strategy shift occurred around the bottom of the graph, where I adopted the open limping, and let him keep barreling style, and you can see that that was very effective. He did make some adjustments to his game in response to that, and we kind of swapped some chips from then on in. Not the sort of player that I would make a habit out of playing, but I think for the purposes of my own game development, it was a good session to play and a good session to review. I hope you enjoyed it. Hit me up with any comments on the forum. Thanks, bye.